you very much for your time and allowing me to share with you on my section in the topic that I'm going to talk about. So let's start by looking at what we have gotten used to since the start of cybersecurity, the perimeter. Okay, so the traditional cybersecurity perimeter is pretty much physical. Okay, there is a clear distinction between what is trusted, and anything within the organization premises, the workspace, or the office, is considered as trusted and where cybersecurity efforts should be focused around. But anything outside of that, okay, is outside of that perimeter is untrusted, and is something that we should start to build walls to protect our assets from. Okay, but this has upended. This has changed. This has changed. So let's look at what the modern infrastructure is right now. Okay, the modern infrastructure has changed that entire notion, and that concept of perimeter is different. Okay, now we have organizational assets that are sitting, users, we have workspaces that are located outside of that traditional perimeter. Okay, we have applications running in the cloud, we have users working from home, a workforce accessing on the go. These have made securing the traditional perimeter very much harder. So this brings me to the main point that I want to make. So identity. Okay, I mean, we've heard from the previous few speakers also talking about identity. So just to recap a bit, what do I mean by identity? So identity can be summed up as something a user has that can validate their permissions and access to certain organizational resources. Okay, an identity can belong to a business user, okay, or a part of the workforce. It can belong to an administrator. It can belong to a customer. Okay, and this is basically which is what they use, this identity, that by these different users to interact, the first point of interaction with the organization. Okay, so how do they authenticate themselves? Okay, this can be logging into a laptop, a mobile device at the start of the day, can be accessing a privileged resource like a server, or can be accessing an application like a CRM. Okay, these are all different types of identity. So traditionally, having that, what we define perimeter that we talked about, it is easy to control how these identities can be used. But with this modern architecture, how do we do this? Okay, what happens when we don't secure that identity? So if we don't secure the identity, I think like what one of the previous speakers actually mentioned, we leave ourselves open to attackers. Because when an attacker, all they need to do is by gaining that identity, an attacker can gain control of the organizational resources that that identity can actually use. And basically what this slide actually says, all the attacker needs to do is just to log in. Not run some advanced attack techniques or exploit some obscure vulnerability. They just need to steal that identity and use that identity. So with all that being said, we can summarize that identity has become that new perimeter. Okay? So identity is the only way that you can actually provide that critical first layer of security in a perimeterless world. Okay? Control who can access what kind of resources, at what time and for what purpose. Controlling the type of permissions that these users actually require. Okay, this is the concept of least privilege. Have the right amount of privilege that they need to accomplish their task, nothing more and nothing less. So let's talk a bit about identity security and how you can use identity security to secure that new perimeter. So just like adopting an assume breach mentality, the concept is to never fully trust a user, an identity. And here's how we actually can go about doing this. So the pillars of modern identity security can be divided into 4 pillars. Okay, you have verifying every identity. You have validating every device that is trying to use that identity. We have limiting the type of access that they are able to use. And fourth, to continuously monitor and analyze and adapt to changes in that access. So let's look at each of these 4 different steps. So, in step 1, we have verify every user. And here, we actually need to ensure that users are who they say they are. So to do this, we must do a few things. First, we must use MFA everywhere. So like Marcus actually mentioned, so MFA is one of the first things that you should actually do, because that protects that first part of how that identity is actually being used. If anything requires a login, it needs to have strong multi-factor authentication to verify that user's identity. So use things like modern push authentication, one-time password, biometric, as well as things like passwordless authentication in order to achieve this. Make things as seamless as possible to make sure that users actually don't mind using it and doesn't interrupt their workflow, but without sacrificing security. Next, we also need to secure those applications and resources behind a single sign-on portal. This allows you to enforce policies on all of your applications. It also provides users a convenient way of accessing all their resources that they have the permissions to from a single location. Okay, you can also allow users to securely perform certain self-service actions, like unlocking their account, resetting their password. And this can also help reducing operational effort from your help desk teams. The third part under verify every user is to make the policies adaptive. Apply different policies based on how users are accessing different resources based on the situation. So if you have a critical application, like a finance app, okay, have additional verification needed before that person can actually access that application, even though they have already logged in the first place. Okay, if a user is trying to access for an application outside of the environment or from a different country, have them do things like additional authentication, like maybe authentication using email before they can use this. You don't need to have one identity policy for everything. You can also be very granular and adapt this according to what's required. So in step 2, we need to validate that the device that is actually being used for that access. As part of the identity verification process, what device they are using is also very important. And this can be part of the criteria to validate that person's identity. So the initial entry point into the organization must have MFA. This entry point is usually their corporate laptop workstation. So basically, everything starts and ends on the endpoint. So the logging into this entry point must be protected with strong authentication. We also must ensure that the endpoint is secure and complies with organizational policies. So this is crucial to ensure proper security measures are in place to protect the endpoint from threats like malware, vulnerabilities, and unsecure configuration. Ensure that high-risk privilege access on the endpoint is only used when necessary. Privilege rights on the endpoint should never be fully given to a user, even if they have legitimate need. Okay? So people like developers or IT administrators, you should only provide only what is needed for their role instead of giving them all the rights on their endpoint. And next is to ensure only authorized applications can run on the endpoint. Anything that is unknown is a potential risk, or at least try and restrict the resources that these type of applications can access, like preventing it from accessing local files or shared folders or connecting to the internet, in order to reduce the risk posed by these unknown applications. So in the third step, now that we look at validating the user's identity and device, let's look at step 3. limiting the privileged access to only to those who need it when they need it. In this step, all full-time privileged access, like those used by administrators to manage systems, should be controlled. Privileged access meaning that anyone who has the permission that can administer a system, they are able to change how a system functions or has high-level access to the data that is being stored within a system. Okay, some of the examples of these privileged access are server administrators, database admins, cloud infrastructure administrators, application admins, and even third-party vendors. Okay, these are the type of people that can have access to privilege rights. So when it comes to privilege, any access that requires a privileged credential should be isolated and monitored, meaning that administrators should only access credentials that are relevant to their role. Okay, when they use those credentials, all the activity that they are performing should be recorded. Okay, what applications did they launch? What commands did they execute? What configuration did they change? All this must be isolated and recorded. And following the concept of least privilege, privileged access should also be just in time. So we've heard this mentioned in the previous two sessions of just in time is very important. Okay, so by default, the rights shouldn't exist permanently and only granted when a user has legitimate need for it. So this reduces this permanent access being used for malicious end or for being exploited. Okay? And especially when using privileged access remotely, ensure that remote access is secure. Use secure methods of access like of authentication, like biometric MFA, and using things like VPN-less access to reduce the risk that these kind of remote access can pose. Especially if those access are used by people outside of your organization, okay, like outsourced third-party vendors. Okay, we also need to ensure proper life cycle and workflow is followed, okay, when using these privileged credentials. Automatically provision and retire privileged access based on dynamic changes in the personnel situation. Okay. So, in the last step, step 4, we need to ensure that all identity events are analyzed and monitored. So controlling identity is just part of that solution. Knowing how those identities are being used is a crucial next step. So all sessions, especially those involving privileged access, should be recorded and audited. So this is important to do a proactive actions or enable forensic investigation when a security incident occurs. The activity of that access should also be analyzed against historical behavior in order to detect suspicious actions. So identifying these threats that may otherwise have appeared normal and may have slipped under the radar. And because also security is a team game, an organization has many security tools at their disposal. So having the identity security tool able to collaborate with those security solutions in place is important. And this is done by forwarding events, as well as suspicious activities, high-risk events, to the Organizational Security Operations Center and the various security tools that they are using for further analysis and actions. Okay. So, with those 4 steps, identity in the organization can be protected. And you probably wonder which vendor you may wonder may help you achieve all of those 4 steps. So want to know further, that is CyberArk. So CyberArk is the only identity security company that is able to help your organization achieve all of those 4 steps that I talked about. So with CyberArk's comprehensive identity security platform, CyberArk is able to help your organization achieve end-to-end protection of your identities in the environment. Whether or not those identities are used by your workforce, your administrators, your third-party vendors, including those that are not even used by human individuals. Things like automation, DevOps, scripts within the environment that are also users of identity. And also with CyberArk's extensive out-of-the-box integration with CyberArk C-Cube Alliance, we also provide the ability to assurance that we can also protect the different forms of identities used in the environment. Okay, so with this, it's out of the box and supported. And not only that, but also with CyberArk's extensive experience, we also provide guided implementation to ensure successful adoption of identity security within the environment to ensure that all of that is actually fully protected. Right, so with that, I come to the end of the session here. Then I'll bring it up for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's take a picture.